When a royal couple becomes bigger than the institution they walked away from, something unusual happens. The story stops being about duty and starts being about perception. It stops being about tradition and becomes about personality. And that's where the real tension begins. There was a time when the phrase, "never complain, never explain," defined how the British monarchy survived scandal after scandal. Silence was strategy. Dignity was defense. Mystery was power. But in the era of streaming platforms, podcasts, memoirs, and viral clips, that old rule feels almost extinct. And no one symbolizes that shift more than Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. So the question isn't just whether they're misunderstood. It's whether they've become their own biggest obstacle. Whether the confidence that once fueled their independence has quietly turned into overexposure. Whether, in trying to control their narrative, they've actually surrendered control of it. When Harry stepped away from royal life, many saw it as an act of courage. A man choosing his family, his mental health, his autonomy. There was sympathy. There was curiosity. There was even admiration. But sympathy has a shelf life, and admiration requires consistency. The move to California symbolized reinvention. New beginnings. Freedom from palace constraints. It also symbolized risk. Because once you leave an institution built on mystique and inherited authority, you have to replace that gravity with something equally compelling. And that's not easy. Meghan entered royal life as a modernizing force. An American actress with confidence, voice, and ambition. For some, she represented evolution. For others, disruption. The media scrutiny was relentless. The comparisons were constant. The expectations were suffocating. And when the couple decided to tell their side of the story publicly, they shifted from royal subjects to media protagonists. But here's where the blind spots may have started to appear. In speaking openly, they aimed to reclaim power. Yet every interview, every revelation, every emotional confession invited not just empathy, but analysis, critique, fact-checking, debate. And once you open the door to that, it never fully closes. Public storytelling is a double-edged sword. It humanizes you. It also exposes you. The Netflix documentary series amplified that exposure. It offered behind-the-scenes footage, personal reflections, carefully curated narratives. It also cemented a perception that the couple was still orbiting the very institution they claimed to leave behind. Because nearly every chapter of their new life referenced the old one. Independence is powerful when it looks forward. It weakens when it constantly looks back. Then came the memoir. Deeply personal, raw, at times painfully vulnerable. But vulnerability in the public arena doesn't guarantee universal understanding. It divides audiences. It invites sympathy from some and skepticism from others. And this is where the phrase, "too full of themselves," starts to echo in certain corners of public opinion. Not because ambition is wrong. Not because telling your story is wrong. But because repetition can shift tone. When grievances are revisited again and again, they risk overshadowing growth. Growth is what the public wants to see. Evolution, reinvention, not just reflection. There's also the dynamic between them that fascinates observers. Meghan is articulate, poised, media-savvy. Harry is emotionally transparent, passionate, sometimes impulsive. Together, they form a powerful duo. But every partnership has an internal ecosystem. A sounding board shapes decisions. A confidant influences tone. And critics argue that perhaps Meghan, with her media instincts and strong convictions, may reinforce Harry's frustrations rather than temper them. That she amplifies his grievances instead of challenging them. Of course, that's speculation. None of us are inside their conversations. But perception often shapes narrative more than reality. When two people deeply believe in their own perspective, blind spots can emerge. Not out of malice, but out of certainty. Certainty can be empowering. It can also be isolating. The royal family operates on long timelines, patience, restraint, calculated silence. Harry and Meghan operate in a faster, more expressive ecosystem. Streaming releases, podcast episodes, public speeches, rapid response culture. That contrast creates friction, and friction fuels headlines. There's also the question of brand identity. After stepping away, the couple needed to define what they stood for beyond royalty, philanthropy, media production, advocacy, mental health awareness, social impact. Yet many critics argue that the messaging sometimes feels intertwined with personal grievance. That causes risk being overshadowed by controversy. That serious topics compete with viral soundbites. When public perception begins focusing more on personality than purpose, credibility becomes fragile. Consider the concept of hypocrisy, a word often thrown into online debates about them. It surfaces whenever there's a perceived gap between messaging and action. Calls for privacy followed by highly public media projects. Criticism of royal hierarchy while retaining titles. Advocacy for environmental causes alongside private jet controversies. Whether fair or not, these contradictions fuel narratives that they can't escape, and once hypocrisy becomes part of the conversation, every move is scrutinized through that lens. But let's zoom out. It's easy to label. It's harder to empathize. Harry grew up in a system that shaped his identity before he understood it. Every mistake magnified. Every vulnerability photographed. Losing his mother under global scrutiny left scars that likely never fully healed. His resentment toward the press feels deeply rooted, not manufactured. Meghan entered that same system as an outsider. Different nationality, different race, different professional background. The pressure must have felt relentless. The criticism at times, undeniably cruel. Their decision to speak out was likely driven by genuine emotion, but emotion and strategy don't always align. Strategy requires stepping back, asking uncomfortable questions, inviting dissent within your inner circle. And this brings us back to the idea of a sounding board. A great sounding board doesn't just validate. They challenge. They test arguments. They question timing. They anticipate backlash. They say, is this the best move long term? The perception among critics is that Harry may not be receiving that level of pushback. That decisions appear reactive rather than measured. That responses feel emotional rather than strategic. Whether that perception is accurate isn't the point. The point is that perception drives public trust. Trust, once shaken, is hard to rebuild. There's also a deeper cultural clash at play. The monarchy survives by minimizing personality and maximizing symbolism. Harry and Meghan maximize personality. They lean into narrative, into individual voice. That shift resonates with some audiences who value authenticity, but it unsettles those who view royalty as an institution above personal drama. You can't fully occupy both spaces at once, and perhaps that's the core blind spot. Trying to straddle independence and inherited relevance, wanting freedom from the system while still orbiting its gravitational pull. Public fatigue is real. Audiences move quickly. They crave novelty. If every project circles back to the same conflict, interest morphs into impatience. Yet it would be unfair to reduce them to caricatures of ego. They have launched charitable initiatives. They have championed veterans. They have highlighted mental health conversations that matter. Those efforts deserve acknowledgement, but effectiveness depends on consistency of message. When humor enters the conversation, satirical portrayals, parody sketches, viral memes, it signals something significant. It means public perception has shifted from sympathy to satire. Satire is not the enemy of relevance. It's the signal that you've become culturally iconic. But it's also a warning that control of narrative has loosened. The more seriously you take yourself, the more power satire holds over you. Confidence is magnetic. Overconfidence invites pushback. There's a delicate balance between advocating for yourself and appearing self-absorbed. Between defending your truth and appearing unwilling to self-reflect. Self-reflection is what audiences crave now. Not just storytelling, but introspection. Acknowledgement of missteps. Signs of growth. If the next chapter of Harry and Meghan's journey focuses less on revisiting wounds and more on forward momentum, perception could shift again, because public opinion is not static. It evolves. Right now, the conversation around them feels polarized. Loyal supporters, vocal critics, and a large middle audience quietly observing, waiting to see what comes next. That middle audience determines legacy. If they can pivot toward projects untethered from palace grievances, they may reclaim narrative control. If they continue framing themselves primarily in opposition to the monarchy, fatigue may deepen. The idea that they're too full of themselves likely stems from repetition, from the sense that self-narration has overshadowed broader mission. But ambition itself isn't arrogance. Wanting agency isn't ego. The challenge lies in tone. Tone shapes trust. Imagine if future appearances focused entirely on impact metrics, on beneficiaries, on measurable change, with minimal reference to past conflict. The shift would be immediate. Silence, ironically, might be their most powerful move now, not as surrender, but as reset. The monarchy still operates by the old adage for a reason. It limits escalation. It preserves mystique. It denies critics fresh ammunition. Harry and Meghan chose a different path. A louder one. A more transparent one. That path offers agency, but demands discipline. Maybe the real question isn't whether Meghan is the worst sounding board for Harry. Maybe the real question is this: are they truly trapped in royal blind spots? Or are we watching two people still figuring out who they are outside a system that defined them for decades? Are they too full of themselves or simply too defensive after years of criticism? And here's the biggest question of all. Will their next chapter be about proving critics wrong? Or about finally moving on? Because growth doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It doesn't trend. It just shows up. If they pivot toward impact instead of explanation, toward results instead of reactions, the entire narrative could shift overnight. If not, the cycle continues, and so does the criticism. What do you think? Are Harry and Meghan misunderstood? Or making their own problems worse? Drop your honest opinion in the comments. I read them all. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who follows royal news, and subscribe for more unfiltered conversations about the royal family and trending headlines. See you in the next one. Reinvention doesn't happen in one announcement. It doesn't happen in one documentary, one memoir, one interview, or even one bold decision to step away. Reinvention is quiet. It's repetitive. It's disciplined. And that's where the real test begins. For Harry, stepping back may have felt like reclaiming control. For Meghan, it may have felt like protecting her family and her identity. But reclaiming control publicly creates a new responsibility, proving that the control leads somewhere productive. When audiences first heard their side of the story, many leaned in with empathy. There was a sense of revelation. A breaking of royal silence that felt almost revolutionary. But revolutions are powerful only when they build something new, after dismantling something old. And that's where critics argue the momentum stalled. Because after the interviews, After the series, after the memoir, the central narrative still circles back to the same conflict. The monarchy, the media, the family rift. It's understandable. Those experiences shape them. But when every major project connects back to that origin story, it risks defining them by it. True independence requires narrative distance. There's also a psychological factor at play. When someone feels deeply misunderstood, there's an instinct to keep clarifying, to keep explaining, to keep defending. It's human. But public opinion rarely shifts through repeated defense. It shifts through visible change, and change doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up in tone, in restraint, in new priorities. The never complain, never explain doctrine worked for the monarchy because it starved controversy of oxygen. Harry and Meghan chose the opposite approach. They confronted it directly. They challenged it. They dissected it publicly, but direct confrontation has a shelf life. Eventually, audiences grow tired of the same battle. The idea that they can't get out of their own way comes from this loop. When one controversy fades, another comment, another clip, another debate surfaces. And instead of the story evolving, it feels recycled. Yet beneath the noise, there are deeper dynamics worth exploring. Harry grew up inside hierarchy, structure, protocol, invisible rules that shape behavior long before he could question them. Leaving that world was not just a career shift, it was an identity shift. And identity shifts are destabilizing. They take time to settle. Meghan, on the other hand, came from a world of auditions, media cycles, and personal branding. She understood narrative construction long before entering royalty. That skill likely empowered their transition into independent projects. But here's the challenge. Narrative construction works best when the audience feels included, not instructed. When storytelling begins to feel overly curated, overly controlled, overly polished, audiences sense it. They crave imperfection, spontaneity, a break in the script. Confidence becomes compelling when it includes vulnerability about growth, not just about pain. And this is where the too full of themselves label sticks in certain circles. Not because they speak confidently, but because critics perceive a lack of visible self-critique, a sense that blame flows outward more than inward. Whether that perception is fair or not is secondary. The impact of perception is real. Public trust grows when leaders acknowledge missteps. When they say, "We learned," when they demonstrate evolution. Without that, narratives freeze in place. There's also the complexity of operating as a couple brand. When two people present a united front consistently, it strengthens loyalty. But it can also make it harder for outside perspectives to penetrate. Internal disagreement, healthy debate, private correction, those are invisible to the public. If Meghan truly is Harry's primary sounding board, as critics suggest, then her influence carries weight. But influence doesn't automatically mean control. Partnerships are nuanced. They involve negotiation, compromise, shared conviction. Still, perception paints her as the stronger strategist, the one guiding tone. That perception shapes how every decision is interpreted. If a move backfires, critics attribute it to her influence. If it succeeds, they credit her ambition. It's a heavy lens to wear. Harry's public persona has always leaned toward emotional transparency. His openness about trauma resonated widely. But emotional transparency can blur into emotional reactivity if not balanced with strategic distance. And strategy is what many feel is missing, not intelligence, not compassion. Strategy asks, what does this achieve long term? Who benefits? Who is alienated? Does this strengthen credibility or simply reignite debate? The monarchy survives on strategy, decades-long planning, gradual shifts, Controlled messaging. Harry and Meghan operate in a faster media ecosystem. That speed can create impact, but it can also create miscalculation. Then there's humor. When comedians, satirists, and viral creators begin centering you in parody, it signals a shift. Not necessarily disrespect, but a transition from tragic figures to cultural characters. Humor dilutes gravity. If you respond defensively to satire, you amplify it. If you ignore it, it fades. This is another lesson from royal history. Silence can neutralize. Mockery. The tension between advocacy and celebrity is also worth examining. Advocacy demands humility. Celebrity thrives on visibility. Balancing both requires careful calibration. If advocacy appears intertwined with self-promotion, critics cry hypocrisy. If celebrity visibility drops too low, influence weakens. It's a narrow path. The term hypocrisy has trailed them frequently. Environmental advocacy alongside private travel controversies. Privacy concerns alongside high-profile media deals. Anti-royal critique alongside continued use of royal titles. Each instance feeds into a narrative that they haven't fully separated themselves from what they critique. But here's the nuance. Transitions are messy. Leaving an institution as old as the monarchy isn't like changing jobs. It involves identity, heritage, legal frameworks, global perception. Untangling that web takes time. The problem is that public patience is limited. Every new headline reopens old debates. Every speech is dissected. Every body language cue analyzed. That level of scrutiny would strain anyone's decision-making clarity, and yet, scrutiny is part of the platform they retain. The more visible you are, the more accountable you become to consistency. There's an argument to be made that they underestimated how long the royal shadow would follow them. That by telling their story once, they believed the chapter would close. But the monarchy is not just a chapter, it's a global narrative engine. It pulls attention back relentlessly. Breaking that gravitational pull requires building something undeniably distinct. A philanthropic initiative so impactful that it overshadows past grievances. A creative project unrelated to royal critique that earns universal praise. A period of strategic quiet that resets public appetite. Instead, the cycle continues. And cycles create fatigue. Fatigue doesn't mean irrelevance. It means the audience is waiting for a pivot. The most interesting possibility is not that they are doomed by blind spots, but that they are at the brink of recognizing them. Public feedback, even harsh feedback, can be instructive if they recalibrate tone, if they shift focus, if they allow space between projects. The narrative could evolve dramatically. Because public opinion is more fluid than headlines suggest. Consider how many public figures have endured backlash, satire, criticism, and then reinvented successfully. The key was acknowledgement, not defensive denial, but quiet adjustment. Perhaps the next chapter for Harry and Meghan will not be louder. Perhaps it will be quieter, more measured, more impact-driven. If they continue as they are, critics will continue to argue they are trapped by ego. If they adapt, critics may lose momentum. At its core, the phrase "too full of themselves" reflects frustration from observers who once felt sympathetic but now feel saturated. It's less about hatred and more about exhaustion. Exhaustion with repetition, with conflict cycles, with perceived self-importance. But exhaustion can be reversed. Distance creates curiosity. Curiosity restores intrigue. Intrigue rebuilds relevance. Right now, the path forward seems simple in theory but difficult in practice. Focus outward, not inward. Let impact speak. Let time cool tension. Resist the urge to respond to every narrative. That doesn't mean silence forever. It means choosing moments strategically. Harry once said he wanted to break cycles. Perhaps the final cycle to break is the one of perpetual response, because in the end, the loudest rebuttal to critics isn't another explanation. It's growth. And growth is rarely announced. It's demonstrated. If they can demonstrate it, not declare it. The blind spot narrative may fade. If not, the conversation will remain exactly where it is. Maybe the real question isn't whether Meghan is the worst sounding board for Harry. Maybe the real question is this: are they truly trapped in royal blind spots? Or are we watching two people still figuring out who they are outside a system that defined them for decades? Are they too full of themselves or simply too defensive after years of criticism? And here's the biggest question of all. Will their next chapter be about proving critics wrong? Or about finally moving on? Because growth doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It doesn't trend. It just shows up. If they pivot toward impact instead of explanation, toward results instead of reactions, the entire narrative could shift overnight. If not, the cycle continues, and so does the criticism. What do you think? Are Harry and Meghan misunderstood? Or making their own problems worse? Drop your honest opinion in the comments. I read them all. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who follows royal news, and subscribe for more unfiltered conversations about the royal family and trending headlines. See you in the next one.